All right, let's get started today with our lecture on the Aztec Empire. Um, so before we get started, I want you to think about this question, right? So it's been a while since we've done a thought question. And in this one, I want you to think about what are some of the ways in which societies maintain the cosmological order. So we recently had Passover. We also had Easter for the Western Christian religions, and Happy Easter to those of you of the Eastern Orthodox religion. So that just happened. So think of some of the ways in which societies in general sort of either maintain the cosmological order or do things that help place them within the spiritual realm. So these activities such as Easter, Passover, things like that, are designed to connect us with the spiritual world. And every society, big or small, from hunting and gathering all the way up to massive complex empires like you'll see today, has some way in which they work with, interact with the supernatural in the cosmological order. So whether it's religious practices such as Easter, Passover, whether it's things like horoscopes, right? So what is your horoscope? Predicting it, and then different ways in which these societies interact with, right, the spiritual realm, the cosmological realm, either through offerings, sacrifices, prayers, things like that. And they can be everything from large, elaborate rituals, such as people making the great pilgrimage to Mecca, doing the Hajj, right, for Islam, or even your daily routine of perhaps saying a prayer before a meal, or saying a prayer before you take an exam, or even putting on your lucky socks right before a sporting event or something like that. Right? There are ways in which societies interact with the cosmological world, and there are ways in which they maintain the cosmological world, such that if you don't do certain activities, the cosmological world may in fact come crashing down around you. So bear that in mind as we dive into the world of the Aztec, because the Aztec, along with the Maya and the Olmec and the Teotihuacanos, the spiritual world is very much alive and well. And in this whole Mesoamerican religious system, it's not just sort of a passive thing with some sort of divine entity. We very much are engaged with the spiritual world and have to be involved in it on a daily basis. So this is a picture of Tenochtitlan, the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, which is now modern-day Mexico City. So this is what it looked like before Mexico City became Mexico City. And the part of the world of Mesoamerica that we're talking about is sort of northwest Mesoamerica. So this sort of blue or this green line is essentially the boundary of Mesoamerica. So you can see how it is Central America, but it's not all of Central America, right? So it doesn't go down into Nicaragua, and it doesn't go all the way up into northern Mexico. This is sort of almost to the land of the American Southwest with the Pueblos and ancestral Pueblo and folks like that up here. So we've talked about the Olmec, we've talked about the Teotihuacanos, we've talked about the Maya, and now we're going to be talking about the Aztec. So the Aztec were the last sort of large civilization to really, this was the big civilization that was in existence at the time of European contact. So where we left off, this is a painting by Jose Maria Velasco from the Valley of Mexico. And this is roughly what the Valley of Mexico looks like. It's a beautiful, beautiful valley with snow-capped mountains, very volcanic, lots of fertile soils, lots of wetlands, and lots of lakes. And the thing about the Valley of Mexico is that the Valley of Mexico has it only has one drainage, and so it's a lake, but it also is somewhat has a lot of salt in it. So it's a freshwater lake, but it has varying degrees of salinity in it. And so in the Valley of Mexico was the city of Teotihuacan, right? So in 500 AD, right, we see upheaval, we see the Street of the Dead torched, and we see massive population decline in the Valley of Mexico and in a superpower vacuum in this region. Remember, the Teotihuacanos were influencing people all the way down with the Maya, right? We see Teotihuacanos actually one or two of them taking over some of the royal lineages in the Maya world. So much so that to that system in the Maya world, you're even considered to be more high society if you can trace your ancestry back to this Teotihuacan lifestyle in the Maya world right before the collapse. But anyway, so Teotihuacano, population decline, it's burnt to the ground. We get this power vacuum. We do see gradual growth, right? So that's 500 AD, and people, there are a couple people still living there. We start seeing some influx of refugees because it's still a nice place to live. You still have good farms, good soils, relatively moderate climate. And so in the southern half, we get refugees from a civilization called the Tula. The Tula were just outside of the Valley of Mexico, and their civilization collapsed, and so they essentially occupy the southern half of the Valley of Mexico. And the Tula were very warrior-like people, and the Tula were in many ways considered to be the centers of high culture, the Tula civilization. So they occupy the southern half of the Valley of Mexico. In the northern half of the Valley of Mexico, we see essentially hunter-gatherers streaming in. And so these are people from the deserts of northern Mexico. So these are the Chichimecs, Acohua, Otomi, Tepanecs, and the Mexica. So you see this X down here. This is actually an SH sound, so it's actually Mexica. So in traditional Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztec, and as well as the Chichimec, the Acohua, and the Tepanecs, they form part of this Uto-Aztecan language family. That X is actually a sh sound. So Mexico can actually be pronounced Mexico. So that's a shift. And so it's interesting. So in the southern half, we have essentially the Toltecs hanging out and setting up cities down along the lakes down this part. And then up in the northern half, we have these hunter-gatherers from the northern deserts essentially setting up shop over here at Cotlichan. We have the Chichimecs at Tanayuca. We have the Tepanecs at Azcapotzalco. And then the Otomi at Xaltocan. So these are all northern desert folks. And you can see the Valley of Mexico. We have Lake Xaltocan and Lake Texcoco, and then a couple smaller lakes down here, Lake Xochimilco, and then I don't remember, Lake Chalco, and you can see this tiny little drainage right here. This is the only avenue out. All the rain water flows in this direction. So this is what's happening. So Valley of Mexico is abandoned, 500 AD, and it starts to get filled up. So starting around 1300s, we're not entirely sure, you get this group called the Mexicas. And so the Mexicas most likely were the last of the hunter-gatherers in the northern deserts, most likely from the Chihuahuan Desert regions. And they enter the Valley of Mexico. Our best guess is around 1300s because we don't have a lot of evidence for them. So if you're looking for a line of research to spend the rest of your life with, try to figure out the origins of the Mexica, who eventually become the Aztec. We don't actually know where their heartland is. It's somewhere in here. And so this is the deserts of northern Mexico. The deserts of northern Mexico are rough. And so whenever you hear people discussing, people migrating from Mexico into the United States, and you just sort of have this vision of them walking across the border. If you went to the Common Hour last year, and they talked about it, it is no joke. You are putting your life on the line every day to essentially cross this vast desert, just to get to the border. And so it's not an easy thing to do. It's a tough life. And so these individuals from the Mexica essentially were from this region of sort of just north outside of Mesoamerica, in the deserts, sort of along this area. And so the idea is that they sort of migrated down through the mountains and eventually ended up in the Valley of Mexico. Now the Aztec, the way the Aztec tell it, and the way the Aztec told the Spanish, when the Spanish conquered them and people were recording their histories and things like that, they came from a place called Aztlan. And so that is where we get the name Azteca. And so they come from this mystical land called Aztlan, or the land of the white herons. And it was an island in a lake, sort of west or northwest Mexico. And like I said, this 1111, maybe one date. We just don't know. But they essentially were led by their god, Huitzilopochtli. And Huitzilopochtli is also translates as to hummingbird on the left. So their god is Huitzilopochtli, and he essentially told them to leave that area and move farther south. And so they were the last to arrive from the north. And like I said, we don't know the exact date that we entered the Valley of Mexico. And they were known by the others in the town, the Valley of Mexico, as people whose face nobody knows. That is the exact phrase for them, right? That is the exact phrase that that the Tula, that the Otomis and all the rest of them were like, we don't know these people, essentially. People whose face nobody knows. And eventually they will, in fact, take over the entire valley. The Aztec, or the Azteca, actually referred to themselves as Mexica, and they are one of several nomadic groups. These nomadic groups are actually called the Chichimecas, so that they are distantly related to many of the groups that are already inhabiting the Valley of Mexico, but nobody really knows who they are. They speak languages that are roughly similar, but not quite the same. And so who are these Mexica? Well, they very much made themselves out to be mercenaries. So nobody liked them. And the only way they could survive was essentially as mercenaries. And so they would go from group to group offering services. And eventually they become they become servants to the Culhuacan. And they try to marry into the Culhuacan family. So they have aspirations of dominance. They want to be part of the royal, the sort of the aristocracy of the Valley of Mexico. And so they marry one of the daughters of Culhuacan. Now the Aztec have a very interesting approach to honoring. So they were told by their god Huitzilopochtli to sacrifice the daughter in his honor. And well, unfortunately with the Aztec very much their worldview involves blood sacrifice. And so the way that they sacrificed the daughter was in fact to kill her and then to fillet her skin and wear it and then invite over the father to show them how much she meant to them in terms of a sacrifice. And as you can imagine, the father, who does not subscribe to this belief system, was not terribly thrilled to see his daughter's skin being worn by these Mexica, and so they were chased out and almost slaughtered. So they had to flee Culhuacan. So they essentially roamed through this until they received a vision by their god Huitzilopochtli. And Huitzilopochtli told Quetzalcoatl, the other god, and who told their priests that they would know where to settle when they found the place of the fruit of the prickly pear cactus. So they essentially were on the run, and they ended up in the swamps. And in the swamps, they found this prickly pear cactus with an eagle nesting on top of it, an eagle resting on top of it. And so this is the vision. This completed the vision. This was our vision. It helps that nobody lived in these swamps. It helps that nobody wanted to live in these swamps. And so this is where they set up shop. And they set up shop and named their capital Tenochtitlan. And so these people, the Mexica, consider themselves to be the chosen people of the war god Huitzilopochtli. And so the place of the fruit of the prickly pear cactus, I guarantee you, if you've seen the Mexican flag, you have seen this origin story, because not only is the country of Mexico named after the Mexica, the Aztec, but their origin story is emblazoned on the center flag of Mexico. So here we have this flag of Mexico. Here we have our eagle on the prickly pear cactus, on this island in the middle of the water, holding a snake. Right, this is the vision that Huitzilopochtli gave to the Mexica to found their city of Tenochtitlan. And so this is Lake Texcoco. Tenochtitlan is essentially right here. This is a map of Tenochtitlan made by the Aztec, and you can see this is essentially the heart of the Aztec world. It is what they call the navel of the Aztec world. This is where everything is important. This is the religious center of it all. And so the Aztecs essentially set up shop here on this island. They create these islands, and in 1428, they have a large enough city that and large enough power that they attack their neighbors. So they attack the Tepanecs. And the Tepanecs are crushed, and they form what's called the Triple Alliance. So the Aztec Empire isn't so much the Mexica as it is the Mexica and then the residents of Texcoco and the residents of Tlacopan. And so they essentially have three, it's really three cities that are governing together that they sort of rotate the governorship, but everybody knows that the power center relies at Tenochtitlan. These are the Nahuatl glyphs for each of the cities of the Triple Alliance. So on the left we have Texcoco, the city of Texcoco. On the center we have the capital at Tenochtitlan. And on the right we have the glyph for Tlacopan. So the Aztec did have a form of writing. They developed a form of writing independent of the Maya and their glyph system. So the Triple Alliance essentially was a military economic alliance, right? So here's Tenochtitlan in the center. Here's Tlacopan to the west, and here's Texcoco to the east. And so Tenochtitlan and these essentially would meet and cooperate. So they would cooperate on wars, they would share their taxes, and they would agree to not wage war on each other because they essentially had to conquer the rest of the Valley of Mexico. So they had to conquer all these cities up here, and they had to conquer all these cities down here as well. So this is the land of the Toltecs and the last of their peoples. And so just to give you a sense of sort of the power structure, 2/5 of the taxes were sent to Tenochtitlan, another 2/5 of the taxes were sent to Texcoco, and 1/5 of the taxes were sent to Tlacopan. As I said, although they were an alliance, Tenochtitlan wielded the most power. Just for reference, the abandoned city of Teotihuacan is up here to the north. So these are some rivers that flow into the Lake Texcoco, and then essentially they made Tenochtitlan out of a bunch of swamps and reeds right here. These lines right here are in fact, these are they constructed roads into the city itself. And this little dotted line right here is a dike that they used to regulate water. So this area essentially was more fresh water than this area out here, a little bit more salt water. So here we have Tlacopan, Tenochtitlan, and then Texcoco. Eventually, through this alliance, the Aztec Empire expands. So here are a series of rulers. So we have Itzcoatl, essentially expanding the empire out here in this direction. We have Moctezuma I, really expanding his empire out here in this direction. Ashiacatl expanding out this direction. Tizoc, who expands this direction. Ahuitzotl, who expands really far out. And then Moctezuma II is the one that you know most as Montezuma. He essentially expands this area right here. And the Aztec, you can see this is sort of a weirdly shaped. The reason why this is weirdly shaped is because these essentially are mountain ranges. So you have to think of this in 3 dimensions, such that each of these are valleys in the area. So these to the west are the Tarascans, who the Aztec were never able to conquer. Axcayatl tried to. This is as far as he was able to go, and there was a big battle here between the Tarascans and the Mexica, the Tarascans and the Aztec. And essentially this was the edge of that border. And then here in the middle, we have another civilization, which I'll get to. They are very much hated the Aztec. And so you can see these sort of holdouts of them. So Tenochtitlan, the capital itself, within 200 years had about 200,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world. And it had 4 stone bridges built to the island. It was very much a Venice type of situation. You can see here on this illustration, this is sort of viewing it from the mountainside, all these different canals. And Tenochtitlan itself was actually really two cities together. So you have Tenochtitlan to the south, and you have Tlatelolco to the north. And it was a multi-ethnic hub for craft production, redistribution, trade, and tribute. And so this is the capital center right here where the Templo Mayor was. All roads lead to the Templo Mayor. This was the religious, this was the economic, this was the civic center of the Aztec Empire right here. And this is probably one of my favorite artist reconstructions, just to give you a sense of how large Tenochtitlan was. And this was something that when the Spanish arrived, something that they would have seen. Just coming over the mountain crest and seeing this massive amounts of people. Here's another view. You can sort of see how these canals were built. And the way that they did this was essentially they would take mud from mud from the soil, from the water, and they would build it up on top. So you get these raised beds types of systems called chinampas. And so what this does is it allows you essentially to have fertile soils up here, and then you can grow your crops and then put them on the boats right here and then take them off to ship them off. And it also provides, by adding soil from the water, you provide nutrients essentially through decaying matter. So it's a really great agricultural system that provides for a ton of food, as well as ease of transportation for shipping that stuff out there. How was it organized? Well, it was essentially a ranked society ruled by a semi-divine emperor. So the emperor was semi-divine. He was technically chosen by a council, but he was considered to be sort of the intermediary between the spiritual world and the Mesopotamian gods, or Mesoamerican gods, and the Aztec world. There were special schools for nobility, and students practiced what was called auto-sacrifice and bloodletting. So one of the key aspects to the Mesoamerican world was that the gods themselves sacrificed their spirits, their essences, in order to create humanity. They sacrificed themselves in order to provide the energy that is and provide the rest of the world. And so we essentially have to return that energy through bloodletting, which is called auto-sacrificing. This was a highly complicated society with priests, ambassadors, warriors, full-time merchants, commoners, and even slaves. And slavery was in some ways a negotiable. It's far more fluid than the slavery that we think of in the 16th, 17th, and 1800s with European colonization. You could get out of slavery much easier in the Aztec world than you could in colonial America. They had extensive trade networks, right? So free trade at the marketplaces, and as I mentioned, it was a triple alliance. Some of the commodities included food, cotton, lip plugs, jaguar pelts, feathers, and cocoa. Here you can see this is what's called the Codex Mendoza. So these were Aztec codices, essentially accounts that they had created. And so you can see all of the different tributes. So one of the ways in which the Aztec Empire worked was that the Aztec Empire was a bit like a mob situation in which they would conquer an area. They'd come over to your neighbor and say, hey, nice territory you got there. We're either going to take it over, or you can just join our club and pay us a tribute. And so most of them would, and if they wouldn't, then they would battle them, and they would battle them such and be so brutal about it that other essentially would intimidate others to fall in line. And if you didn't pay up, then you would essentially get beat up. Now there were holdouts, as I mentioned, the Tarascans to the west, but you had to pay tribute, and so you had to pay tribute to regular tribute to the Triple Alliance. And so here you can see gold, jade, feathers, woven textiles, spondylus shells, which are from the coastline. Another thing that was interesting was that one of the forms of currency were the beans that you find for that you make chocolate out of. So cacao pods and the beans inside were a form of currency. But as people are people, that's essentially growing money on trees, right? Well, some people actually tried to forge these beans that you would use to trade, and the Aztec had it written down that if you were caught peddling, selling, creating these types of things, you would be put to death. So there were harsh penalties for forging money in the Aztec world. One of the ways that we know about the Aztec world is through something called the Templo Mayor. And so the Templo Mayor lies beneath modern-day Mexico City. So when we get to the lecture at the end of this about the conquest of Mexico, Mexico City is directly on top of the Aztec Empire, on top of Tenochtitlan. And so in 1978, an electrical company was they were trying to lay in some groundwork for some stuff. And so here we have essentially the main downtown area, and they discovered the Templo Mayor. So they discovered large stone steps at the base of the steps. So here's the Templo Mayor right here. Essentially, they uncovered it. What the Spanish had done was essentially level the Templo Mayor, which was the exact center of the Aztec Empire, and pave over it. But they left behind essentially the foundations of the Templo Mayor, which is what we're right here. And so here we can see the steps, and they built the Templo Mayor. The Templo Mayor was constructed in a series of phases, with each new ruler essentially adding onto it and making new offerings. And they found, interestingly enough, this gigantic stone at the bottom of it. We can see right here. Here's this stone. Looks like it's like a woman with her hands. She's decapitated and she's chopped up. It's actually found at the base of the steps. Side note: if there was somebody who was working for the electrical company, and when they first had come across this, the electrical company had tried to cover it up, but somebody realized that this seemed to be really, really important, and so they essentially did a whistleblower type of thing where they let the government and the archaeologists know, and then the archaeologists came in and were like, "Holy smokes, what is this?" So if it hadn't been for that person essentially reporting this, we might have lost everything, right? So another argument for why we need to preserve our cultural heritage. And let me tell you why. So here's something called the Aztec creation myth.
Before the earth had form, there was Kotliku, the Earth Mother. She swam in the chaotic waters in the darkness before time. She created the moon and the stars, called the Senson Hotsnahua. She had a daughter, the earth goddess Koyol Tsauki. Her children ascended to the heavens to live and rule the sky. One day, Kotliku found a ball of hummingbird feathers. She tucked them into her dress for safekeeping. After a while, she discovered that she was pregnant. Her children in heaven were ashamed of their mother. "Who is the father of this child?" they demanded. It was a ball of hummingbird feathers, but no one believed her story. Her children decided to slay their mother for the great shame and dishonor she brought them. Kotliku heard the news that her children were coming to slay her. She was terrified and tried to run. She could already see them advancing towards her over the hills. "Do not be afraid. I am ready," came a voice from the unborn child. It was then that she gave birth to the fiery sun god Huitzilopochtli. He emerged fully armed, bearing his burning sword Tsiukola. With one stroke, he slew the angry earth goddess Koyol Tsauki and sent her body tumbling towards the chaotic seas. The top half of her body went into the heavens, and the lower half crashed into the seas, forming the earth. After this, Huitzilopochtli went up to the heavens to rule over the moon and the stars, and Kotliku descended below the earth to ensure that the earth bore fruit. It was one of her sons.
So that is right. So that's the creation story, and the stone that they found at the base of this temple was in fact Koyol Tsauki. So here you can see her head. Here are her breasts. Here are her legs. Her arms up here. And so what they discovered was in fact this giant base stone here at the epicenter of the Aztec world was where they would recreate this this origin story. And so the idea is that when somebody was sacrificed during certain times of the year, which was in a way to both make sure that the world continued, as well as essentially reenacting these origin story events, the idea was that the individual would be sacrificed at the top and their body was tossed down, in parts down to essentially this location right here. So reenacting this event of their origin story. Which gets us into ideology. So the ideology of Mesoamerica really combined warfare, sacrifice, and agricultural fertility. And so this is the calendar stone of the Aztec world. And there are three major elements to Mesoamerican religions. So one is something called world making. So ceremonial centers and mythic events, right? So they made all of these things. The second one is called world centering. So the constructions of buildings that focus on ritual and daily life. So this was the construction of the Templo Mayor at the very center of the Aztec realm. And then we get world renewing, so a commitment to rejuvenation through rituals, including sacrifice. So the Aztec world, and indeed the Mesoamerican world, was one of rejuvenation. It was cyclical, right? So there is no beginning, there is no real end, but we have to renew it, right? So we do these rituals to renew the world, and this is viewed through the human body. So the human body, in and of itself, is the nucleus of the cosmos, and it's filled with powers throughout your life. So you start out essentially with one set of powers, and as you go through the rest of your life, you're continually filled up. So some people have extraordinary superpowers. So these individuals are the warriors, lords, artists. You could think of them as your natural talents that you have. Whatever it is that makes you special, that gives you that gift of if you're an athlete, you're an amazing athlete. If you're an amazing artist, you're a musician, you're a writer, you're whatever. All of these, whatever your special skills are these supernatural powers that were given to you by the gods at creation. And so the idea is that you go through life using these powers, and eventually your body, when you die, you essentially your powers and all those things are returned to this sort of large nexus of the world. So you go back into the big giant mixing pot. And this works, and we could tell this in something called the New Fire Ceremony. So this occurred once every 52 years. So this happened, we know, in 1507 CE. And so days prior to this, the Aztec world participated in ritual extinctions of fire, the casting of statues and hearthstones into the water, and clean sweeping of houses, patios, and walkways. And so in anticipation of this fearful night, women were closed up in granaries to avoid their transformation into fierce beasts who would eat men. Pregnant women would be put masks of essentially agave leaves. Children were nudged to avoid being turned into mice while asleep. And so in 1507, the fire priest from Tenochtitlan ascended to a nearby hill called the Hill of the Star with a captive warrior. And so one of the aspects of Aztec life was that they would engage in something called flower wars. And so flower wars were when the Aztec would fight neighboring cultures like the Tarascans and things like that, and they weren't battles for conquest so much as battles for captives, and these captives were being used then for sacrifices. There are other aspects, and actually I'm getting a lot into this. You can watch the optional video, the extra credit video on human sacrifices when I go into more detail about this, but essentially they would go to war for captives, and really what they really wanted was a captive warrior who best epitomized Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilopochtli being the war god. And in that video that I showed you, remember they talked about Huitzilopochtli emerging from his mother? In Aztec life, if a mother died in childbirth, that was actually viewed in a favorable light because that was essentially reenacting the birth of Huitzilopochtli. So somebody who dies at childbirth is actually thought to have been given, was actually a blessing. So anyway, so back to the Hill of the Star. So the fire priests from Tenochtitlan descended to the Hill of the Star with this captive warrior, and they looked for what's called the Pleiades constellation, what we call the Pleiades constellation. And they watched for the movement of this star, and they called it as Tianquitzil, or the marketplace, and it's this cluster of stars. As it passed through essentially the meridian, the center of the sky, it signaled that the movement of the heavens had not ceased. And a small fire was started on the outstretched chest of this captive warrior. So essentially sort of down on their lower chest part. So this fire was started on there. And then before the fire was extinguished, the priest would then essentially sacrifice the warrior. So he would cut open the warrior with a flint knife, take the heart out, and thrust it into the fire of the individual. And then when people saw this, the populace cut their ears and splattered their blood in a ritual flicking of the fingers in the direction of the fire mountain. And what this did was this essentially represented a new fire. And so this fire was then, that's burning on this guy's chest with the heart in it, essentially was then taken to, was put on torches and things like that, and were taken back to the Templo Mayor, and this fire was then disseminated throughout the kingdom. What did this ritual do? It ensured the rebirth of the sun and the movement of the cosmos. So the idea is that by taking the spirit essence of this individual who embodies the purest form of a warrior, because they were the warrior people, you are then essentially releasing that essence that is needed to make the world go, and continuing the world on. Because for the gods, it takes a lot of effort to do all the things that we do, right? So the gods themselves, what the gods are growing things, the sun, it takes a lot of effort for the sun to get up every morning and cross the sky, right? It takes a lot of effort for the world to go on. So they need this energy. And in turn, they give us energy back through crops and birds and life and all those other sorts of things. So doing this ceremony was critical for making the world go back. And if we think back to the opening question, what are some ways in which societies maintain cosmological order? This new fire ceremony was one of the ways in which the Aztec made sure that the world continued on. Without it, there was no guarantee necessarily that the world would continue on. And so you're like, well, that sounds awesome. How do you know all of this? Well, some of the best evidence comes from something called the Codex Beringia, in which we actually see this documented right here. So you have this poor guy and his heart essentially being taken out. This is being stabbed and taken out. And so this is the glyph for the new fire ceremony. And out of it, you get this spirit, right? So here comes the essence in the new fire that allows for the world to continue on. And here's our warrior. You can tell he's a warrior. He's got the nose piece across right here. He's got some of the headdresses, or the headdresses up here. This looks like part of an atlatl. So for the religion, right, of the Aztec world, right, it was very much an interdependent relationship. So we, as humans, are beneficiaries of divine favors. Rains, corn, maize, love, all these sorts of things. We are benefits of the divine favors. However, like I said, they can't do it on their own. So we have to repay and re-energize the gods in order to make the world work. So that's really at the beginning of this lecture when I talked about some of the ways in which societies maintain cosmological orders. That's a way in which the Aztec world maintained cosmological orders. Excuse me. So that's essentially the world in which that's the Aztec world. So, right, so we get to this, so this is what's happening. So this is the world in which the greatest extent that all of this is happening. And so that's the Aztec. But what eventually happens to the Aztec? Well, this is the conquest of the Aztec Empire. So hold on. So what I want you to write down from this part basically are the main names of the players involved. So let's get started. So, right, we all heard the Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 or whatever that sort of nursery rhyme is, right? So Columbus makes four voyages, 1492, 1493, 1498, and 1502. In 1500, the city of Nueva Cadiz was founded on the island of Cubagua in Venezuela. And so we actually see, we just sort of think of like Christopher Columbus shows up, but really, when he shows up, that sets a whole thing in motion. So there are numerous colonies that spread throughout the Caribbean, as well as Central and South America. And fun fact, we don't actually know what he looks like. There were no actual authentic portraits of Columbus. This is a picture that somebody had created of him at a much later date, long after he had passed. So here we have the Aztec Empire. Here come the Spanish, Columbus, right? So in 1493, they set up a colony at Hispaniola. In 1500, they set up a colony on an island off of Venezuela. In 1502, Ahuitzotl dies, and Moctezuma II takes over, and he continues his expansion. So we can see here, Ahuitzotl dies, Moctezuma expands the empire. Little does he know that the Spanish are already doing their thing out here in the east. In 1508, the island of Puerto Rico is essentially established. In 1509, the island of Jamaica, or Jamaica, was established. So Jamaica, even though now it was a former British colony, actually was originally a Spanish colony. In 1511, a Spanish colony is set up in Cuba. So by 1511, we have 5 colonies set up in the Caribbean and South America. In 1518, we get one of the first, we get Juan de Grijalva discovering the Maya city of Tulum. Moctezuma, right? Hey, right. So one of the sailors noted, quote, "We followed the shore day and night, and the next day, toward sunset, we perceived a city or town so large that Seville would not have seemed more considerable nor better. One saw there a very large tower, Tulum." So he's out checking this out. Meanwhile, in Havana, the Spanish hear of a powerful kingdom to the west, and so in 1519, very young Hernan Cortez decides to set sail. So initially, he was granted permission to go by the governor of Cuba, Diego de Velázquez. But however, Velázquez has second thoughts about the ambitious Cortez and withdraws the permission for the trip. But by that time, it's actually Cortez was up in Havana, and he gets this letter from Diego de Velázquez. And Diego de Velázquez is in Santiago, which is all the way in the bottom part of the island, bottom southeast, and he essentially says, "Oh, yeah, okay. Well, by the time you get this letter, I'll already be gone." And so essentially, he sends this note back saying, "I'm sorry, but I'm already on my way." And so he leaves, right? He leaves with 11 ships and 500 men. And so, curious side note: the conquest of Mexico was actually an unsanctioned expedition by the Spanish government because the governor of Cuba was jealous of Cortez because he was afraid that Cortez was going to get all the glory and all the riches and everything like that. But Cortez continues on. So Cortez' first stop is in Cozumel, Mexico, where he meets a fellow by the name of Jeronimo de Aguilar. And so Jeronimo de Aguilar is a Spanish shipwrecked friar. And so I go back to sort of this image right here, 1518, Juan Grijalva discovers the Maya city of Tulum, right? So prior to this, there were at least one or two expeditions, or at least, we don't really know exactly how the Spanish friar ends up on the island of Cozumel, but he does, right? So he is a Spanish shipwrecked friar, and so he was taken captive, and he was a slave, and so there he learned how to speak Yucatec Mayan. So he spoke Yucatec Mayan, and he spoke Spanish, because the Maya were still alive and well in Cozumel and in the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. So Cortez essentially picks up this guy, refuels, and continues on westward. The next stop is at Potonchan, near Tabasco, along the Gulf Coast. There he has his first major battle with the Chontal Maya, and he's victorious. And so the defeated chieftains they sort of say, "Okay, we're sorry. Here's some food, clothing, gold, and by the way, would you like some women?" And so they also talk about the Cuhua and the Mexica to the west. And so this is the first time that he's really starting to put a name to this massive civilization to the west, because the Maya, while there, they weren't the civilization that they were looking for. One of these slaves was in fact a woman by the name, eventually you might have heard of, called La Malinche. She's also known in her native tongue as Malintzin, or in Spanish, Doña Marina. And so La Malinche is a bit of a tragic figure. She's also a very controversial figure, depending upon who you ask. So she was born into a noble family, and she spoke Nahuatl. However, when her father died, her mother remarried, and she was sold because she was sort of down along the coast, sort of the southern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, at the border with the Maya and the Nahuatl speakers. She was sold into Maya slavery. Her family was done with her. And so then she was offered to Cortez. So the Chontal Maya, who were defeated, one of their slaves was Malinche. So she becomes a mistress to Cortez, but importantly, she becomes a translator. So the way that Cortez was able to navigate the complex social world of Mesoamerica was Cortez spoke Spanish, right? And so did Aguilar. So Spanish. So this is our Spanish connection. Aguilar spoke Yucatec Maya, which is also what Malinche spoke, because she was a slave in this Maya, Chontal Maya. And Malinche also spoke Nahuatl, which is the native language of central Mexico. So this was the language of the Aztec. And so by being able to speak both Maya as well as Nahuatl, Cortez more or less could navigate through most of Mesoamerica. So Cortez continues on, and he lands in Veracruz, the land of the Totonacs, and he's greeted by Aztec messengers. By this time, word has reached the Aztec Empire of this strange group of people showing up who look totally different from anything that they'd ever seen before. And Cortez's policy has always been, his policy ends up being one of, on one hand, being very, showing a lot of militariness and showing a lot of strength, but also sort of, it was sort of a stick and carrot approach where he would, not be afraid to use military might, but also try to bribe people with gold and silver and those sorts of things. So what does he do? He imprisons the Aztec messengers, and in order to really show how awesome he is and how fearful they should be, he fires off a cannon, which is undoubtedly the first time they had seen gunpowder. And then they're sent back to Tenochtitlan with a message to Moctezuma that they would like to meet. So he's like, I want to meet you. We want to talk about you. We want to talk to you about essentially setting up a relationship with our great lord of Spain. He also, in Veracruz, gets word that some people in his crew want to go back to Havana. So somehow word has reached some members of his crew that this was actually not a sanctioned expedition. And so some of them really don't want to do this. They want to go back to Havana. They want to go back to Cuba. So what does he do? He essentially unloads all the cargo and he scuttles the ship. Says we're not going back. They actually set up a small town there along the coast where a lot of the sailors and things like that, some of the older sailors who were not going to march inland, essentially were left behind to protect all this stuff. So the thing about Moctezuma I, his greatest flaw in all of this really was he also was trying to play this sort of appeasement and military game. So what Moctezuma I would often do is he would also try to bribe or pay off Cortez into leaving, and then he would try to set up a trap for him if he didn't. So, and all that really served to do for the Spanish was to emphasize or to reaffirm their belief that there's just mountains of gold hidden in Mexico for them to take. And so when he had sent when Moctezuma had sent gifts with these messengers. This is Friar Sahagun's Nahua informant said, they wrote this down, quote, they laid before them golden streamers, quetzal feather streamers, and quetzals are a beautiful green bird from the tropics, golden necklaces. When they have given them the gift, they appeared to smile, to rejoice exceedingly, and to take great pleasure. Like monkeys, they seized upon the gold. It was as if they were satisfied, sated, and gladdened. For in truth, they thirsted mightily for gold. They stuffed themselves with it and starved and lusted for it like pigs. You might say, oh, wait a minute, Professor Hart. How do they know about pigs? Well, there are wild pigs in Mexico and Central America. I can attest to them. I have seen them in Belize. So the Nahuatl, the Aztec, definitely knew about pigs, just not domesticated ones. So from there, they essentially march across. They spent several months exploring the area, and they won over the Totonacs. So the Totonacs joined them. They convinced them to join them to win over their Aztec rivals. And so then they tried to go over to the next group called the Tlaxcalans. And so the Tlaxcalans are the mortal enemies of the Aztec. The Tlaxcalans, the Aztec Empire is right here. The Tlaxcalans essentially are sort of in this region. And once again, Cortez has a battle with the Tlaxcalans a couple times, and Cortez says, "I want to be your friend. I want to be your friend. Stop attacking me." And eventually, they do decide to side with him, and they decide to side with Cortez because they want to get back at the Aztecs. So then they continue to march on, and they go to the town of Cholula. So right here, and the Tlaxcalans are like, you can't go in there, don't go in there, don't trust Cortez, you can't trust the Aztecs, they will betray you. And so Cortez says, no, I'll trust them, we've got to maintain a positive front. It turns out the Cholula actually was a trap set up by Moctezuma, and Cortez finds out, and they manage to sort of pull a double switch on the Cholulan warriors, and they capture the town of Cholula. So then Moctezuma essentially is like, oh, what, them? Never heard of them. And so he continues to send gifts trying to bribe them away. And Cortez continues to say, I still want to meet with you. And so they continue their march towards Tenochtitlan. So they arrive in Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma made the Spaniards welcome, and he put them up in really a sumptuous palace right in the center of the city. However, once again, the sort of the betrayals are right and left, right? So Moctezuma really planned to capture Cortez and sacrifice them, because he essentially had them in the capital center. And Cortez essentially was going to do the same thing. And so he was going to capture Moctezuma and then essentially govern from there. And so Cortez more or less finds out about the plan, and he takes Montezuma prisoner. And so from the inside of the palace, he essentially governs Tenochtitlan. And so essentially Moctezuma goes out and announces these decrees at Cortez's behest. So they suppress sacrificial rituals. So all of these sacrifices were not okay with the Spanish. They didn't understand it. They didn't like it. And so that, of course, made the Aztecs happy, because essentially that's their worldview. Meanwhile, so Cortez is in Tenochtitlan doing this. Meanwhile, the governor of Cuba is pissed. And so Diego Velázquez de Cuellar essentially there's the governor of Cuba, and he says, arrest Cortez. So they put an arrest warrant out for Cortez, and so Cortez catches word of this, and he has to return to the coast. When he gets to the coast, he battles some of the Spanish who are there to arrest him, and then he convinces the others to go with him. He's like, look at all this gold I've got. He leaves a guy in charge of Tenochtitlan called Pedro de Alvarado. And Pedro de Alvarado is one of these characters that is just the worst. Pedro de Alvarado will eventually become governor of Guatemala and really put down the last of the rebellions of the Maya. But Pedro de Alvarado is just the worst. And so what does Pedro de Alvarado do? So he, the Aztec are going to do the ceremonies to honor Huitzilopochtli. So this is part of their regular season. Going to do these ceremonies, going to do sacrifices and stuff. And as they're about to do this, he essentially six his soldiers on them in the plaza there, and he massacres all of them. And that's really it. There had been a lot of things building up to that time, but essentially the massacre of all your sacred priests and all the hierarchies and all that sort of stuff, and the prevention of your religious practices in a world in which you have to do these for the world to continue on, is just too much for the Aztecs to take. And so the Mexica armies attack the palace where the Spanish are all resided. So they attack Axayacatl. And so Cortez he essentially comes over the mountaintop into this valley, and he sees like the city's in chaos, fighting's going on. So he has to fight his way back into the city. And one of the reasons why we know that the rulership of the Aztec Empire was one that was nominally elected was, in fact, the council of the Triple Alliance gets together, and they say, you know what, Moctezuma II is just not. He's like, something's wrong with him, and so they depose him. They essentially they're like, no, he's kicked out, and his brother is actually elected. Montezuma comes out and he tries to stop the people from fighting, from trying to get into the city, and at which point he is killed. And so there are various accounts. So some people say that the native accounts say that he was killed by the Spanish. The Spanish say a stone was, when he made his appearance over the ramparts, the stone essentially got up there and it hit him in the head, and it knocked him out and killed him. So it's not entirely clear how Montezuma dies. But, as you can imagine, Cortez is pissed off. He gets back, and I imagine he said something like, you had one job to do, right? So Cortez was busy getting rid of his arrest warrant along the coast of Mexico, and then he comes back to find the city in turmoil. And so they're trapped. And so you get what's called La Noche Triste, the sad night. So on June 30th, 1520, the Spanish attempt to flee at night. Now, the Spanish have a lot of things with them, right? So they've been getting all these tributes, they have all these feathers, they have all this gold, they have everything with them. They got cannons, they got horses, and they are in fact slowed down by gold. They're slowed down by their lust. They try to sneak out at night, but is in a city. If you're carrying cannons with you, if you're carrying gold with you, you've got horses. You're going to make a lot of noise, and so all the city essentially wakes up, and the city just descends on them. So there's this rolling battle that ensues, and so this heavy battle as they try to escape the city. And they have to retreat to the Tlaxcalans. And there's epic descriptions about people being captured in these primary accounts by the Spanish, and then essentially they are taken back to the Templo Mayor where they are then sacrificed. And it's just this. It's the scene that's depicted is pretty brutal. And yeah, they can't. Some of them manage to escape, some of them don't. And it's not just the Spanish that are there too. So their Tlaxcalan allies are there as well. And so they've picked up all these native allies along the way who are with them, who kept on saying you can't trust the Aztec, you can't trust the Aztec. So they are also damaged. They're also in this fight too to escape. And so here they have to essentially fight across these bridges to get across the lake. And there's these sort of roaming battles throughout time and time again. And eventually the last battle really is right here at Otomampan, sort of the last battle before they're able to get out of the mountains and back into the land of the Tlaxcalans, where they regroup. Unfortunately, it takes them several months to regroup. They get reinforcements, but the one thing that I haven't talked about so far is disease. So the plague, the Spanish and Europeans brought with them a number of diseases, one of which is smallpox. And I'm sure you've heard this before. These diseases ravaged the indigenous world, really and truly did, and there was nobody that was safe. And so by the time that the Spanish had returned to the Tlaxcalans were in the throes of a smallpox epidemic. And so some of the people that they relied upon, some of the elders that trusted the Spanish, had died. And so it was their younger individuals who didn't trust them as much, but seemed to be willing to engage with them to defeat their enemies. So they regroup, taking a couple months in where the Tlaxcalans are, and so they get about 700 Spanish and 70,000 native troops. So the thing about the conquest of Mexico isn't that it was a combination of a couple factors. First and foremost, certainly disease, right? Another one is there were a lot of Native Americans who didn't like the Aztec, and so the conquest of Mexico would not have been possible without the cooperation of a large portion of Native Americans. And there's essentially intense fighting along the way into the city. And they decide to wage a several-month siege of Tenochtitlan. So the benefits of being on a lake, so you have transportation. Problem is, you can also be sieged. And the siege essentially allows for smallpox to ravage the city. And so at some point, Cuitlahuac dies of smallpox and replaced by his nephew. Eventually, on August 13th, the Spanish decide to invade 1521 and capture the city. And so the Tlaxcalans essentially exacted their final revenge on the dreaded Aztec. And so that essentially brings to the end of the Aztec Empire. But what the Spanish then do, they set up their city of essentially Mexico City in the province of New Spain. And that's how we end up with something like this, where the center of Mexico City right here, with the cathedral and everything like that, is right next to the Templo Mayor in the Spanish or of the Aztec. Because what the Spanish did was when they conquered something, they leveled it and they put their stuff directly on top. And you'll see this all throughout Latin America. We see this in the Inca Empire. We see this, anywhere you go. If there's a church, odds are there's probably something important underneath it, because that was the way the Spanish colonized things. So that's it for today. I will see you for next lecture.